welcome everyone to our discussion on fleeing conflict, transcending trauma, and the plight of refugees. This discussion cannot be more timely as Vermont and this area in particular, in Manchester, Dorset, are beginning to resettle refugees for the first time. We were approved by the State Department in February, specifically for Afghan placement assistance. So we are very proud to introduce our case manager, Sadina Razuli. Thank you so much, Sadina. And our first refugee, Abdul Wali Akbari. So thank you so much. We're so happy that you could be here with us. The reason that we have been discussing this issue several times and over several years, the first time we did the retreat in Manchester on dealing with trauma, is that this is a topic that's only increasingly being discussed and addressed, but it may be one of the most important in terms of a refugee or anyone who has witnessed or been the subject of violence or torture, especially during conflict, which is even worse because during the conflict there's also mass violence going on. And I myself became very acquainted with the topic from my own experience serving in UN peacekeeping, and after my first mission, which became one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world, I only learned later that I also had trauma. So this became a topic of my own pursuit, and this is also a reason I went to divinity school. And through one of my professors, Dr. Richard Molika, who is an expert also on trauma, I was introduced to Dr. Karen Fondacaro. And so Karen also shares a lot of the same notions, but she's an expert in psychology, and she has a plan of action of addressing trauma. So I'm going to briefly go over her background and then hand the floor over to Karen. She's going to give a presentation, and then we are going to open this discussion, open for questions. And I also wanted to say that in addition to being approved by the State Department, we are adopting a refugee resettlement program according to the UN Global Compact on Refugees, which is resettlement with dignity and resettlement with self-sufficiency. There are over 800 million refugees in this world, and they cannot all be on assistance. And so this is why there's a new action plan or agenda for addressing refugees and their resettlement. So without further ado, I'm going to give you the bio of Karen, and then we will begin the program. So Karen is currently a professor emerita in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of Vermont, and she is director of Vermont Psychological Service Center. Over the past 35 years, Dr. Fondacaro's clinical work and research has focused on interpersonal violence and the mental health of survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and political conflict. In 2007, Dr. Fondacaro established Connecting Cultures, a clinical science program designed for the mental health needs of refugees and asylum seekers. In 2009, she co-founded NEST, the New England Survivors of Torture and Trauma. Connecting Cultures and NEST have collaborated with numerous community organizations and served refugees from over 30 countries of origin. Dr. Fondacaro has been a principal investigator on federal grants regarding refugee mental health. She has also conducted numerous national and international academic presentations and has published peer-reviewed scholarly articles on refugee mental health. Dr. Fondacaro and Connecting Cultures program is the recent regional recipient of the 2020 W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Engagement Scholarship Award. Wow. So congratulations, Karen. And I think, I'm not sure if you will address that, or maybe understanding the definition of a refugee can also bring to light why the trauma is so important. Because you can't be a refugee unless you have reached the threshold of fleeing violence, fleeing a situation in which your life is under danger and it's not possible to stay anymore in the place of where you are living. So that already would open the gates to trauma. So I'm going to give this presentation over now to Dr. Fondacaro.
Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. I'm so excited to be here, and this is the first time since COVID that I've given a presentation in person, so I am going to dramatically throw off my mask. I've done numerous Zoom presentations, and it's just so nice to see real people. So I'm really glad to be here. So as Yvonne said, the name of the programs that I work within is Connecting Cultures and then NEST. And NEST, as you can tell by the logo, the idea is, exactly as Yvonne said, really providing a resettlement space and then helping people to be self-sufficient and be able to integrate into their new environment. And that's where the birds are sort of flying off together with their cultures and communities. My little hand signal there. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the refugee crisis, just to give you some background. Trauma-informed care, limitations of the post-traumatic stress construct, just because that's something that many people hear about, PTSD, post-traumatic stress, as one of the problems that come with traumatic experiences. And then also talk about a new framework and an intervention that we use. And I'm hoping to work with the Manchester area too, to do some training so that clinicians can work, that we can all work together as best we can in the state to provide the best intervention for trauma as possible. Just to let you know, as we go through some of this, it can be sort of traumatic for people even to listen to some of this. So you're welcome to get up and take a walk around if you want to, or also feel free to ask me any questions as we go along, okay? You don't have to wait till I stop talking, because I could talk about this topic for a very long time. So please feel free to ask any questions. So, as Yvonne was also saying, the definition of a refugee is a person living outside their country and they're unable to gain protection from their own country. And it's based on these 5 reasons. They can't gain protection because there's a fear of persecution, or the person has been persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And membership in a particular social group, I've worked with individuals who come from countries where being gay is against the law, and therefore people have been tortured for those reasons. And they've made the argument that if they go back to their country, and the reality is that they're in danger of being harmed again. So they seek asylum in the US, and some of them in Vermont. This number, 84 million refugees and IDPs, does anybody know what an IDP is? Except you, Yvonne. It's an internally displaced person, so people who are displaced within their country of origin. And a refugee is someone who finds another country to resettle in. It doesn't find, they may be chosen based on application, it's a process. But as of the mid-2021, it was 84 million refugees and IDPs. Now you have to add 12 million Ukrainians. You have to add, since January 2021, 638,000 individuals from Afghanistan. So the number is about 100 million at this time, which is really outrageous and exponentially growing. Really, it is the biggest crisis we've ever had globally. And something that not a lot of people know is that about 50% of refugees that we see and who are resettled are children, so under the age of 18. So think about traumatic experiences and think about the kinds of services we need to provide to help people be successful. And we're talking about children who've witnessed violence, talking about adolescents who are going through their identity issues, talking about adults who have experienced torture, or people who have witnessed family members be tortured. So it's a whole range of individuals and ages. And in Vermont, you know, Yvonne brought up Dr. Malika, and I think in Boston they're primarily working with the Cambodian population in their program. In Vermont, we have people who literally are coming from over 30 different countries. So the kinds of things that we have to learn about and the different cultural differences and nuances and cultural idioms of distress, all of that is really takes time and I think a community effort for sure, and that's why I'm so thrilled everyone's here. So the plan is to bring in about 100 to 150 individuals from Afghanistan. About 40% of them will be minor children. And as I just said, Vermont's resettled refugees from over 30 countries, and we have well over 8,000 refugees in our state.
I think that Vermont has already, that was the plan, 150, but it's now more about 200 are already here. Because Brattleboro resettled about 95.
Wow.
And Chittenden County, about 150.
Okay, so this is,
And more to come.
yeah, so these numbers, every time I do a presentation, I have to go in there and change my numbers because they continue to change. So there we go. I'll have to change that slide for next time. Thanks, Yvonne.
The slide still looks great.
So just to give you a very brief idea of connecting cultures, we did not start out with all these services. We did, 2007 feels like yesterday to me now. And, well, I'm sure to many of you also. But we really started out literally just going into the communities, because what I was told by the refugee state coordinator at the time was that we know individuals have suffered trauma, but individuals from other countries don't perceive mental health in the way that we do. They're not going to go look for a therapist. They're not going to come into a clinic and say, yay, I want to talk to somebody about my trauma. So for about 2 years, we really sat with people from different cultures and got to know who they were and asked them, what does mental health mean to you? What is your idea of mental health in your culture? What is the word for sadness in your culture? Do you have a word for depression? What's anxiety? And again, with 30 different cultures, there's all those different answers that you might get. But what do you think was the single answer that we got the most when we did focus groups and asked people, what does mental health mean to your culture? What do you think people came back with and said? Every group we spoke with came back with mental health means you're crazy. And so people were really viewing mental health as the extreme, sort of major mental illness. Someone with psychotic features, someone who really is maybe even stigmatized or ostracized from the community. So, and really what we're talking about when we talk about mental health is mental well-being. We've really started using the word well-being, multidisciplinary well-being groups and teamwork, and even when we do individual work, it's about well-being. It's not about mental health, which means crazy to many people who we work with. So we want to be careful with that. So we started out with psychological services because I was the director of the mental health clinic in our psychological science department at UVM. And so as I was directing the organization, I also noticed the need for the refugee services. So we started with psychological services, but we quickly realized that people needed help with housing. People needed help with employment. So we really started in a graduate school program with graduate students working on their PhDs, doing some of the groups with the different cultures of origin, let's say, and also started with masters in social work at UVM. And what happened eventually after the 2 years is people started coming to the clinic. they started coming to the clinic, connecting cultures, started building trust with the different communities. So we actually now have a waiting list. So one of the things I really want to talk about is capacity building and how we're going to make sure that we have enough people providing the services that really are needed. We also realized that people had legal needs, so we partnered with Vermont Law School. We're still partnering with them. We also partner with the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. They are our cultural brokers. They're also case managers for many different refugee groups, not just from Africa, all the different refugee groups. And I co-lead their case management meetings, and the work that they do is just amazing. And these case managers are refugees from around the world, and just a wonderful group of caring people who care deeply about their own communities. For physical health, we have a psychiatrist who works with us, Dr. Smita Lahoti, and also for those individuals who've been tortured, they've often experienced some kind of chronic pain. So we do have a director of physical therapy services also who works with us. So we try to do multidisciplinary services and really provide some holistic, culturally responsive services to individuals who are interested in the services. And as I said before, we started with the community outreach. That's still critical. Constantly have to go into the communities. We go to weddings and funerals and celebrations and any kind of events that we're invited to at this stage of the game. We also have a research program that we've established as we've been working with many refugees. And again, many of the refugees and new Americans have built trust. So often, I mean, it's all de-identified, nobody's individual information is in there, but we really learn about what are the factors related to resilience, what are the factors that are going to predict better outcomes, and a really important part of the program to keep the program evaluation moving along.
Karen, could you explain what you mean by resilience and what that means in terms of an individual?
Yes, and I have a slide with a big exclamation point next to resilience, because we talk about the trauma and the experiences of trauma, and people go through trauma and what are some of the problems they have. The biggest thing we see is resilience. And one of the graduate students I'm working with now is doing her dissertation on resilience. So, and I just listened to her proposal for her dissertation. So, and it was fascinating because all the little pieces stuck in my mind, and I found myself even bringing it to the case management team today, saying, let's talk about what resilience is, because we can't forget the strength-based side of things. We could so easily, in our Western minds, fall into the mental health piece as opposed to really, really honoring resilience. So some of the factors that have been shown in the research to be related to resilience are things like someone has family support, somebody has community support, which is going to be critical for people who come to Manchester, community support, that they have some kind of spirituality or religion that they are attached to, that is a resilience factor. Another thing is that they've found some kind of meaning despite the horror that they may have gone through, that they've been able to find some kind of meaning. And then another factor that came up was sometimes people think because they've gone through a lot, or sometimes even providers or people who work with refugees and new Americans think, you know, how can I enjoy myself if I'm working with people who've had it so challenging? And what we find, in order to really not burn out and to be able to continue to do the work and to be resilient yourself as a community member, as a professional, as a provider, is to find some joy in your existence. So it is amazing when I'm working with someone in my office and they can smile and they can dance and they can sing, and they can also know that they've gone through, you know, horrific events. So those are some of the factors, but I think we're going to build more on that concept of resilience. But I think that connection is really critical. People talk about their kids being a form of resilience too. But family, community, really connection and support is so critical. That answer that question?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
You can grade me.
I'll give you an A.
So we do direct clinical services. People come into our clinic. We also have a satellite office at the Association of Africans Living in Vermont because many refugees and new Americans feel really comfortable in that organization. So we have a Connecting Cultures room in there. We also train professionals, community members, ethnic communities, and I really want to also, my interest now is starting a program to be able to really train providers to provide the intervention for people who are really on the extreme end of suffering. So there are 3 phases of migration. People tend to think about sort of the trauma and torture that people have experienced in their home country, but there really are 3 different phases that are really important to understand. So that phase 1 is really the pre-migration, and what happens there is the political conflict, is living in that war-torn area, is witnessing family members be hurt. It's witnessing loss of your family members. It's absolutely a horrific experience for people to go through. But the in-transit or flight, phase 2, whether there's a journey or someone's been brought on a plane from their home country, the journey of leaving your country is not just like, oh, okay, I'm going to go move to another country. You're losing your country of origin. And the new Americans that I work with talk about their country as their mother, as they're leaving their country of origin, that people love their countries. They don't necessarily want to leave their countries. They don't want to be hurt. They don't want family members to be hurt, but it's a big loss to lose. They talk about the mountains and the rivers and the beauty. Just imagine if you've lived in Vermont for a really long time, you know the beauty of where you live, and then just being forcibly displaced to another place and calling that home. So that migration phase can be very traumatic also. And then last but not least is post-migration is not an easy task either. It's not, yay, I'm in another culture, I don't speak the language yet necessarily. Have you ever gone to another culture and thought you knew the language and you didn't quite know it as well as you thought you did? I do it all the time when I go to Italy. I'm like, oh, I got this. And then I'm ordering 15 desserts and really just wanting 2, and you know. But when people are here, we really have the responsibility to provide them with the support and connection that they need because we want people to be successful. We want diversity in our communities, but it means we also really have to support people coming here. Now I want to talk about trauma-informed care because it's an important lens for people to look through when they're working with individuals from other cultures and people who've basically gone through trauma. Okay, this one has a few little moves throughout it. So what trauma-informed care is, it's understanding the impact of trauma for clients or patients through a trauma lens. So for a child or a youth, right, so you have a 10-year-old who's sitting at their desk and they're spacing out, they're not doing their homework, they might be dissociating. They might be thinking about a lost family member. It's really important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily just bad behavior. It's something to be understood. It's something to communicate with the child or youth about. For adults and parents, we tend to, in our Western world, use a very disordered language. We have the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Diagnostic Disorders, and so everything is labeled a disorder. And when people go through some of the tragedies, the events, the 3 phases I just talked about, we don't consider the person disordered. We consider the war disordered, the events that occurred as disordered. So it's sort of respect for the person who's gone through these events. And like I said before, not everyone ends up with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what people tend to think about when they think about trauma. in your general population, about 20%, if you look at Vietnam vets, people in car accidents, any kind of events that are traumatic, you get about 20% of that population that will end up with what we call full-blown post-traumatic stress, meeting diagnostic criteria. Doesn't mean people don't suffer, but it's really important, I think, to be more holistic and think about the different things people might be going through. And what we find is depression does occur in about 32%, anxiety in about 11%, and for survivors of torture, you do get maybe upwards of 80%. It could be as high as 80%. There's a number of studies out there, but if someone has been tortured, their likelihood to have post-traumatic stress is going to be much higher. Also, something that we don't always talk about, it always gets left for the end, I left it for the end of this presentation, is the impact on providers or caregivers or community members who work with refugees and new Americans or trauma individuals who've gone through trauma. There's something called secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Yvonne brought that up. People do end up with their own nightmares, with their own worries. When you care about someone who's gone through a hard time and they tell you their story, you share that story with them. That's part of the intervention. But in sharing the story, you also take a piece of that traumatic experience. And there are ways, very important ways, to deal with that. And I'll give you a little bit of the answer now before the test later, which is connection. Really being able to. I had heard the most awful story. As a matter of fact, I was in my office and one of my interns called me in, and we had this way of working together where it was, if the story felt so horrific that it was hard to handle as one individual, call me in my office, we'll go through it together, we'll do this as a group. So the clinician calls me in, and even with the three of us in the room, I left there really, really feeling, I'm not even gonna say the details of it because it's not necessary, but it was a horrific situation that involved children and mothers and a horrible torture story. And I was noticing that I was really having a hard time. I was having some nightmares because of it. I was thinking about the client a lot of the time. And I ended up realizing that my son at the time, he was going off to college. So I kept picturing him in some of these horrible situations. So I was also going through this own thing in my own life of my son leaving and then building him into some of these traumatic things. It was really hard until I took a walk with one of my colleagues, and for about an hour we took a walk. Maybe I cried for about 25 minutes of that hour, and I kid you not, it was really being able to share the story with her and to be able to have my emotions associated with it and to deal with it, that I was not haunted by it in the same way. But we as providers and community members have to take care of ourselves too. Does that make sense to people? And it's the biggest thing that providers forget because they want to help. And they want to help, but then they can sometimes feel guilty if they're taking care of themselves. The other thing when you're working with new Americans is you have to deal with the cultural context. We really have to have what we call cultural humility. We'll talk a little more about that. Okay, cultural context. So it is slightly different than the last one, the last presentation. Okay.
Can you tell she's smiling?
I know. The first time I gave a presentation for my husband, who's not Italian, and he said, "Could you just put your hands down by your side?" I said, "Are you kidding me? I know. How can I do that? I can't do that." Which is why I like standing up and not doing Zoom. I can't do this over Zoom as well. So some of the idioms of distress is the term I used, but what we hear from people is, "My heart hurts." You often see people do the heart connection when they talk about their trauma. My heart hurts. My head is overwhelmed. I have a problem with my heart-mind connection. Many somatic complaints. If in your culture you don't have words for depression, anxiety in the same way that we do, It may be that you have a headache, it may be that your stomach hurts. It can sometimes come out more in physical or somatic complaints. And there's all kinds of research to show that refugees and new Americans at a higher level compared to the general US population will have somatic complaints. Eye contact, you know how when we're talking to our children in the West and we're saying, look at me, and now I want you to do your homework, but look at me first. In many cultures, direct eye contact is actually a sign of disrespect. So knowing which cultures might think that and not just assuming that our way is the way. The meaning of mental health, some of the causes we hear are spiritual possession is why someone has a serious mental health concern, or ancestral deities are getting back at the person. So many different ideas, and because we work with 30 different countries, it's not like I can rattle through all 30 right now, but what it leads to is really being able to talk to the person that you're working with about what are your views. And you don't have to know it all before you work with someone. You certainly want to know something about the culture, something about how they view mental health, well-being, but then you really want to be curious and ask questions. There also may be cultural barriers to help seeking. In many cultures, going in and seeking services is stigmatized. I mean, it's still stigmatized in the US, let's face it. So, also what we want to do is pay respect to traditional healing practices. There are many traditional healing practices out there that work for people in their cultures. Now, we don't want to really agree with things that may be harmful, and we want to figure out how to work with a person around those things. But there are many traditional practices. I think of in the Bhutanese culture, in the Nepali Bhutanese culture, they have a jumping doctor. And a jumping doctor does this dance, and a jumping doctor helps heal the person. This is something that works in their culture, and we don't want to take those practices away from people in their culture. Does that make sense to folks? Also, to know things, and I'm speaking about the Nepali Bhutanese, what we have found, and we've done some research on, we had a number of suicides in our community, in the Nepali Bhutanese community, a number of years ago, and the rate of suicide for resettled Nepali Bhutanese is 2 times higher than the general population. So we want to know those things, because if we're working with people and they are saying that they want to hurt themselves or they wish they were no longer here, which is another sort of interesting piece of information, is that the Nepali Bhutanese are less likely to say that I want to hurt myself, or less likely to have what they call suicidal ideation, but they may be more likely to endorse, I wish I wasn't here. So we learn as clinicians how to then assess where a person is at and ask them, like, well, what if you weren't here? Would life be easier? As opposed to, are you going to hurt or kill yourself tomorrow? Does that make sense to folks? So these are like little nuances that you learn over time, but for each culture, again, the biggest thing is curiosity and listening, and also acknowledging that when we're with another person from another culture, we're bringing our own culture with us. And people think, oh, because we're in the US, we don't have, what's our culture? We have plenty of culture, and it's very different than many different cultures. So really knowing what you bring to the room, what family you grew up in, how do you handle anger, how do you handle traumatic events in your life, and to really know yourself in that regard. It really takes a lot of work for everyone involved. Any questions before I get into this is the kind of treatment that we do for children and youth and families, and then I'll go into the adult stuff. But any questions before I go into it? Because this is a little bit more specific and a little...
I hate to ask all the questions, but I wonder if you can also explain, for those who are suffering from trauma because of conflict or prolonged conflict, often in many of the societies, there is a problem of violence and domestic violence.
Yes.
And is that due to unresolved trauma? And what is the trauma and the violence
Well,
connection?
Domestic violence is, we see a lot of domestic violence. And part of it is this cycle of violence. When you have been exposed to a great deal of horrific violence, it's something that, you basically learn that violence is part of how humans interact with one another. The other big thing that we see is shifts in roles between men and women, where women maybe had less power in their country, and then when they come to the U.S. and they may be gaining more power, that's very hard for the shifting roles in the family, and for, or if someone, another role that shifts, let's say someone is the head of the household, is the patriarch of the household, and also was a physician in their home country, but they're not going to be a physician in the U.S. because you don't get to do that. You have to go through the full schooling again here. So you lose your professional identity, you lose your sense of self, you lose your role as patriarch of the family. That's very stressful for people. And I think it's hard to sometimes understand that the perpetrator of violence is also going through tremendous stress, but being able to take this holistic perspective. We of course want to protect the person who's being victimized, but I think violence just becomes another avenue that is sort of modeled for people. I would also add, as one of the big things we see, is substance use. Alcohol and substance use, which lowers your inhibitions and you're more likely to engage in violence. And imagine, going through a torture experience or a traumatic experience, you might be left with a little rage and a little anger that's not resolved, understandably, as a human being. If you can think of the time when somebody really hurt you in a way, it leaves you with some feelings. And if you don't really take a walk with a friend for an hour and a half and cry for 25 minutes of it, and really deal with it, you're likely to maybe be a little quicker to anger. Does that answer that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we have this recent, and I'm very happy to say, a SAMHSA grant, and we work with Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Saida Abdi from the University of Minnesota, who's also my co-leader of the case management group. I really enjoy her. She's originally from Somalia. And we also work with the cultural brokers from ALV. And together, and I should say Dr. Lauren Dewey is the Connecting Cultures psychologist on my team, who's really leading this project from the Connecting Cultures side. But we're in the school systems with the kids. And it's really a very nice, well-being focused intervention. So it's called Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugee Children, Youth, and Families. And so what we do first is community engagement. So this is all strength-based. This is making sure that the kids are on the soccer team, making sure the kids are going to camp if they want to, making sure they have friends. Like really, that largest number of kids are going to be fine, and that's tier 1. But we're going to make sure all of those things are available to them. Tier 2 is where someone is in school and they're being discriminated against because of the color of their skin. They're being discriminated against because they don't speak the same way as other kids. This happens with kids and youth all the time. They maybe experience a culture of stress in their family. They're speaking English quicker than mom or dad, and that causes some stress in the family. So these groups, very strength-based, but it might be, let's talk about what kind of stressors you go through, and very much based on coping skills. So very positive. We do some deep breathing, some mindfulness, how do you communicate, that kind of work. And then the third layer, or the third tier, is for that kid who needs some trauma processing. And again, not every kid is going to need it, not every family is going to need it, but for the kid who does, it's a school-based, one-on-one individual counseling meeting, and there's a whole system set up that Dr. Saida Abdi and Heidi Ellis and a number of individuals from Boston Children's Hospital really put together, and we are training therapists in how to do this work. So in this tier, you're teaching kids, and I'll show you, I brought one of like the worksheets, so I'm getting really specific about this is what happens in the room. And then in tier 4, which this is your smallest number of people, but you're going to have some families where there may be violence in the home. There may be parents have a substance use issue, or there's some kind of a safety issue in the home. Then we bring the treatment right into the home.
On the school-based therapy that you said is one-on-one, is that something other than short-term therapy? And if so, who provides the therapy?
So we have a team of supervisors who know the program, and then we also have a team of clinicians. So the clinicians go in who are trained in how to do this work.
But they're not necessarily the employees of the school district?
No, they're not.
Okay.
They're definitely not. They're people who are being trained by the SAMHSA grant.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're part of Connecting Cultures. They're our clinicians from
Okay.
Connecting Cultures.
Do you have English teachers to go to people's houses to help them learn English?
It's a great question. There are English classes that are being given from the Association of Africans Living in Vermont, from Vermont USCRI. There are a number of different programs who do the English lessons. We do not, but definitely needed.
We have when my father was in school, they had people going around to different houses to teach
That's beautiful.
people to learn to read and write and so forth.
That's beautiful, and I love the idea of doing it in home, because especially older folks have a harder time sometimes. And we do provide the clinical services in their home, but we specifically don't work with the English language. But I'm hoping that somebody is doing that. I'm not aware of the top of my head.
Well, I'm curious what led you to get into this field, and also I could throw out a term which is kind of erroneous. A good laugh and a long sleep will cure just about anything, but it only works for babies and elderly.
I don't know. A good laugh, I think, works for anybody, and maybe a good sleep too. Why did I get into it? It's a very good question. I grew up in an Italian family with 4 brothers, and I was the only girl. And they always say, "Oh, Karen, you're so full of baloney. You were just one of us." But anyway, with that said, I was always interested in intense kind of work. So it started back in 1982 when my professor was working on criminal evaluations when I was in graduate school. And he was doing an evaluation of someone who had committed a sexual offense. And I said, "Oh, can I do one of those?" He said, "You can't do one of those." Like, basically said, "You're a girl." Wow. It doesn't sit well with somebody who has 4 brothers. So I started initially working with individuals who committed crimes, but then I really got interested in the people who they were hurting, and wanted to work with the kids who'd been sexually assaulted. And then that automatically leads to working with domestic violence and with all kinds of interpersonal violence. And then it was 2007 that my interest really turned to the refugee and new American population, because I was asked if one of the programs I was doing would assist people from hurting their children who came from countries where it was okay to use corporal punishment. And as cliche as it sounds, I really had like a spiritual moment, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this work forever. The rest of my life I'll work with refugees and new Americans. And the end of December, I no longer am teaching classes and directing the clinic. I'm only working on Connecting Cultures and Nest.
Also, your point about looking somebody in the eye. They say you should not look a dog in the eye. They would take it as a threat, and probably other animals too.
Good point. Right. And knowing who you're dealing with, right? And what their beliefs are. So this is what we do for kids and youth. I'm so proud of this program, and I hope we can help spread it throughout the whole state now that we have kids in many different places. The idea is building safe, caring relationships, understanding behavior in the context of trauma, being culturally responsive, teaching emotion regulation to the kids. And I'm going to show you very quickly, but this is something that mostly like you want to be the clinician to really be interested in this stuff. But this is like what kind of thing a youth might learn. What was happening right before you got upset? Things you can do to continue to feel okay and in control. And they really work all of this out with the therapist when they're doing the one-on-one. What was happening when you started to get upset, when you started revving up, which is a trauma response, when you start getting triggered by something, okay? Things you can do when you start to become upset. Talk to someone, take deep breaths. Then you start losing control. I start dissociating because I'm thinking about what happened in my home country, or I get so angry I want to punch another kid. What was happening when the problem got out of control? What can you do to stay safe and keep yourself from losing control? It's done in a loving, compassionate way. It's not like, what did you do wrong, you're bad, and here's your consequence. It's let's together talk about what happened, and often you'll find out what the trigger was that may be related to their traumatic reactions. And then in the end is reconstituting how did things calm down afterwards, and how can you practice those skills. So those are things that they do and really go through. Like someone gets into a fight with someone at school, they'll go through it. But again, it's not the usual, you got in a fight, that's wrong, here's your consequence. It's like, let's really learn from this so that we can together work on giving you some skills so that you don't end up getting re-triggered and re-traumatized.
Is play therapy offered for kids to help deal with their maybe repressed feelings or anything?
I am guessing some therapists do. This has data behind it. I come from a psychological science program, so we're very, we want to do the program that has shown success.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing some people do play therapy. I don't think it's harmful, but this has been one of the best therapies I think we could find. And we have so much support from Boston Children's Hospital and from Dr. Abdi and the other people involved, so that's why we chose this one. So for adults, we do trauma-informed care, and also lots of parenting programs. I'm going to try to wrap up a little quicker.
That's fine.
So the most common Western-defined mental health concerns that we do see in the literature, when you read any articles about refugees and New Americans, what did I say? Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, somatic symptoms, alcohol and substance use. And I will, say every day that these are not disordered people. We need to have a holistic, they're not people to be fixed. They're people to support and understand and provide strategies. So what we see when we see people who come into our program, on the next slide, he's getting it down too.
Supposed to be the left hand.
Is,
Screwed up.
as we said before, resilience and strength. Number one, people come in and I am amazed what people have gone through and how they're standing on 2 feet and doing so well and cooking for their families and really doing okay. The biggest thing we see is grief over loss of their country, loss of family members. You can just imagine the level of grief that people experience. That there's sometimes, look at the housing in Vermont. It's hard to get housing that's not horribly expensive. So people often are struggling with employment and poverty issues, language barriers, the new culture, unemployment, as I said. Think of the loss due to the pandemic. Many refugee individuals had a lot of losses. And then also you do see traumatic stress. And that this is often chronic. It's not like, when I think of post-traumatic stress, I think of, oh, this event happened. You had a car accident and now you have this trauma. You had the war and now you have this trauma. When I work with groups of women from Somalia and they say, last night my sister got killed. That's not, it's not past. It's ongoing often. The wars are still going on for many people. So we came up with a framework. It's called the Chronic Traumatic Stress Framework. and this is the definition. Chronic traumatic stress is not a disorder, but rather the contextual experience of persistent traumatic events, both past and continued, that occur at any point across the lifespan, with sequelae that are perceived by the individual as impairing, regardless of symptom constellation or threshold. And the important part there is sometimes in some insurance companies or what have you, you have to meet criteria for a certain disorder in order to get a certain number of sessions. And the reality is you might have a totally different mix of traumatic responses that don't fit into our DSM book, and that's okay. Everyone experiences it slightly differently. So the definition really just opens up for, yeah, I've got some sadness, some anxiety, some this, some that. I'm not full-blown PTSD, but I do have, I'm grieving the loss of my child for a really long time, which is, sometimes the case. So we came up with this framework, and it really is a framework for people to do research and to do clinical work. And really, it's just a more holistic framework to show that we're looking at past and current war trauma. We're looking at those post-migration living difficulties, not just the past. We're looking at daily stressors. The car won't start. Those daily stressors can have a serious impact on traumatic events. And then what we also look at is the protective and risk factors that come with the individual's coping skills, their family connections, their community, their spirituality and culture. And then for our outcomes, we want to look at resilience and strength, psychological wellness, and physical wellness, not just the negative stuff that happens, psychological and physical distress. And we also want to look at traumatic stress symptoms. It's just a more holistic way of looking at what someone goes through. And so if you look just from a post-traumatic stress framework, you're just looking at the past, you're just looking at the individual, and you're just looking at traumatic stress symptoms. And we wanted our intervention to be wider.
Right.
So cultural humility is a very big deal in our, we do an assessment package, and we are actually working on a new one because our other one was too long. We felt like it was a little bit too much for folks. We're working on it, but it's all about what is your view of the problem, what does well-being mean to you and your community, really listening to the person and doing a full-blown assessment package, and then coming up with what we call a MAP, a multidisciplinary assessment profile. And we write these 3-page evaluations up, and then whoever is providing the service gets a copy of that evaluation that starts with the person's strengths and the culture that they're coming from and the languages that they speak. And the other thing we did after the assessment is we did develop a chronic traumatic stress treatment. I don't have time to go through the modules, but there are 10 modules. We also received an NIH SBIR grant. It's called the Small Business Innovation Research Grant. And we
NIH, not everybody.
Oh, NIH is the National Institute of Health Small Business Innovation Research Grant. And we created a language-free app because everyone has phones. Everybody has phones, but not everybody speaks English. So we created an app that goes with the treatment. So people they create an avatar of themselves, and then they go through the treatment, and then between sessions they can practice some of the things. So I'm just going to tell you what the 10 modules are and what's in our app as quickly as possible. It includes support. It includes what we call narrative exposure light. That's where the person has the opportunity to tell their story if they want to. Many treatments say, it's good for you to tell your story, take your medicine, tell your story. That's not necessarily the case. It's very important that people choose their own timing, and when it's their story. They didn't ask for it. They get to say it when they want to. And then this is representing coping skills. So I'll move a little bit quicker, but these are our modules: the mental health discussions, safety, values, behavioral activation, coping skills, sleep hygiene, working with thoughts. When you've gone through trauma, you have thoughts in your head that can be pretty nasty. Humans are pretty nasty to themselves in general anyway. We tend to have more negative than positive things. We don't walk around saying, I'm a really smart person. I'm a really, great person. I like myself. Mostly we're like, oh, why did I do that? Or, I wish I knew more about that. And so we tend to have more negative thoughts circling around in our head. And with people who've been traumatized, that just gets amplified. So we really do some working with thoughts, acceptance and tolerance of emotions. That doesn't mean you accept the events that happened, but that you have every right to experience the emotions in response. And then the narrative exposure and life path exercise and a celebration of life. And we have all of this published, so.
Yeah, you do.
So here's our avatar. People can pick the color of their faces and put on hijabs or whatever. We have different stock things in there for people to make their picture. People love doing this part of it for some reason. It's fun. Or they say it's fun. And so, as I said, in the first module, we really are emphasizing strength. We are talking about torture and trauma, finding out what their idioms of distress are, and also we tend to learn in their language how to say 1 to 10 so that we can do from 1 to 10 how intense a feeling might be. So I have my students learning how to sing 1 to 10 in certain languages, and it's quite funny. Okay, so there's the avatar. Here's one of the things we do after the first module is a guided deep breathing. So you'll see there's no words, but once you've learned how to use it with your therapist and an interpreter in the room, during the week you can use the guided orb goes in and out and practice it. And we did a little study, and I'm very excited to say we did a brief intervention with the app and the chronic traumatic stress treatment, and in a very brief intervention we have significantly lowered levels of anxiety, depression, and an increase in coping skills, and really good frequency of use of the app, because they were given their iPads to take home, and they actually used it each day, which was shocking. So, but it was really good news. Then we talk about safety. Do you feel safe at home? Do you feel safe in this room? What makes you feel safe? Because people are a little less trusting, don't necessarily feel safe within their own bodies, within this new culture. So, and we have pictorial representations. This is all laid out in the manuscript. Module 2 is for safety, and we have in the app, there are stock photos of different cultural things like mala beads or different things for different cultures, or people can take that, and there's a built-in camera, and they can take pictures of things that remind them of safety. And what you do is you just go on your phone like this, and it gradually reveals the picture. And once you do that a number of times, there's like this, I don't know if people have ever used fragrances, like you smell a little frankincense and sort of gives you a sense of relaxation. That little picture, when it gets revealed, and it's your young child who you care about, or your spouse, or it can really, every time it's used, become more and more of a sense of safety. We do a values exercise. Rather than what's wrong with you, we say, what's important to you? What do you value in your life? What brings you joy? What makes you laugh and sleep longer? That to really start building in the joy too, and that it's an important piece. And this has all kinds of therapeutic techniques behind it. It's under a theoretical framework called acceptance and commitment therapy. I could go into that for too long, much longer than you'd want me to. And then the next module, on the app for that module, we have pictures that people take pictures of the things that are important to them. And then we do behavioral activation, and that's where we really make plans for what are you going to do this week, because when you're feeling intense and anxious and sad, you do not want to get up and do anything. So it's a gradual working with someone to take a walk, to get out of bed for the day or whatever it might be. And this depends on who it is that you're working with, of course. But it's called behavioral activation. It has lots of empirical support behind it.
Good. Gonna go too fast?
Nah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yep.
All right.
You can go again. Module 5 is coping skills. We really work on all different coping skills. And so we have, I'll give you some examples in the next slides of different things that are on the app. We have some seated yoga people learn to do, just as, little ways to help them activate. We have a body scan relaxation. Then we have something called grounding for if somebody does dissociate and has trouble with that. They learn how to really engage all their senses. Like if you've ever taken a walk and there's like a zillion birds around here, and all of a sudden you say to yourself, I haven't even listened to the birds for the last 15 minutes. I've been walking for 25 minutes and I forgot to listen to the birds. And then you stop and you listen, and they're amazing, right? Or stopping and smelling something. So we have many different techniques that we build in there for really engaging your senses. And when someone's dissociating, which means they might be thinking about their trauma, the story may be playing in their head, we may say, let's go around the room and name everything that's the color blue. And it brings them into the present moment. So it's those kinds of things. Obviously, I can't go into these things in tons of detail, but Module 6 is sleep hygiene. People have trouble sleeping when they've been traumatized or have been tortured, so we really practice different techniques for sleeping better. And there's a series of flashcards on the app that just is reminders of go to bed at the same time if you have insomnia, if you have trouble sleeping. Don't drink alcohol right before bed, don't drink coffee right before, and it shows like routines. And then the working with thoughts, you could do basically a whole semester of class on how we do that and how we help people not get caught by their thoughts and ramp their emotion regulation. And not ramp their own intensity of feelings up by their thoughts, and really be able to know that if I think, for example, the example that always comes to me, I'm a bad mother because I didn't protect one of my children, to know and learn that that thought might keep coming up, and what happens when it does, and what can we do differently so that you don't continue to be so nasty to yourself. Okay, and then again, this is something called, we do cognitive restructuring and cognitive diffusion, but these are techniques that take a while to learn. So another thing we do is, this is one of my favorite ones, and I have been known to pull out my phone and do this one myself, which is when a thought is really bothering you. You take it and you put it on a leaf and you watch it go down the stream. You can touch the leaf and it flows down, and you can touch it, and you just sort of like putting thoughts on clouds and letting them float away so that they're not constantly hammering at you and getting your physiology all worked up further. Okay, and then acceptance and tolerance of emotions. It's okay to cry, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be sad. What do we do during those times? And then exposure, and we call it exposure light because, again, I think the biggest thing is you want people to tell their story when they want to. We've done it in groups, we've done it individually. This idea that is in many of the trauma books, like, you just have the person tell their story over and over again, is not, I think it doesn't apply to refugee and torture survivors in the same way. I really think giving them control is critical. And this is the lifeline exercise we do. This is like somebody's whole life that they've put out, and the stones or clouds represent events in their life that are traumatizing, and the flowers are the positive things. I was born, I had a birthday party, or what have you. And we do that first so someone can see their life in a lifeline, and then they can gradually pick which stories they want to talk about. And then we have a big celebration. So that is, and then there's other assessments and stuff.
Another question. How can we learn more about these apps? Seems like we all want to have those apps on our phone.
Yes, so it's going to be open to everyone. I think the way they're setting it up now, I'm working with a tech company called Game Theory. They're setting it up on Google and on Apple. That's it.
And what will be the name of the app?
And so it's called Connecting Cultures Nest.
Oh.
And I think what we'll do is, I think somebody has to write me an email to get it, but I mean, it's all happening within the next couple of weeks. And then the published article would be a good way to like know something about how to use it. But I think what we also need to do is put together a manual for the app. So that's probably the next thing.
Oh, that's like a lot.
Yeah, yeah, but it's sort of straightforward too, and I think the manuscript that's out there explains it enough, and I'm going to be available to talk to people, but we definitely have to get a manual that goes with it for, you know, for the person who's working with the new American or the refugee, just so that people all understand what each module is supposed to be doing.
I'm so sorry, what was the name?
It's called Connecting Cultures Nest or Nest Connecting Cultures. I'm not sure which one. So we also do asylum evals for asylum seekers. I have heard that individuals from Afghanistan are not going to have to go through the asylum process and they're going to come in as refugees. Is that true?
No. Most of the Afghans coming here are called parolees. So what they sort of, because of the nature of the evacuation was so fast, usually there is a process of
Right.
asylum. So they're able to get, able to work, they get a social security number, and they can get social benefits, public benefits, Medicaid, go to school, but they cannot be full-blown refugee. They still have to apply for asylum.
Okay. Okay, so we do asylum evaluations too. Now we're getting more and more
We're
referrals.
probably will integrate that as well.
Yeah.
Provided, because we have several lawyers part of the
Nice.
Grace Initiative, so
Yeah.
I think that we'll be able to develop the asylum
Great.
applications.
Great.
And just today, the Office for Refugee and Resettlement from the State Department issued for Ukrainians to come in.
Yes.
They will also be paroled. They will
Oh.
not have asylum status. So it's sort of like fast track entry into a country, but not necessarily at a refugee status.
Got it.
The people who have refugee status were already in process, let's say in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
for a long
They
time.
have a special immigrant visa.
Yeah.
And so that's probably a small number of people, but yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Sorry. First, I want to thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question. There are the Afghan refugees here, and then many of us are involved with them. And they came, they got housing, the kids are now in school, and there are services helping them, but are they getting any help with this kind of program?
We're hoping to integrate that. It's part of our process for volunteers. In fact, we have an expert right here who has volunteered, Dr. Lisa Katapano-Friedman. Lisa, would you like to stand up? She's a psychiatrist, and she's going to be working or helping Grace Initiative, and Karen also will be helping on the mental evaluations. I think that Karen and Lisa have worked out a strategy.
Well, not exactly a strategy yet, but we've got ideas.
But
so.
we're working on the mental.
And then the one thing that COVID gave us was the Zoom capability. So, and we've been using interpreters on Zoom. So because we're so far, 2 hours away, there may be a way to do the training program such that we have people from Burlington, people from Manchester working together, and then even providing services across to people in different places.
So what we're planning to do, as Karen and Lisa might have mentioned, or Karen, we will integrate mental evaluations in our program, but they are also planning a training program so that they can train other people to do mental evaluations throughout the state, because we're just fortunate enough. We've had Karen helping us, Lisa, and Dr. Richard Lodico supporting our program, just like 3 world experts in mental well-being. So, but their training program will be able to multiply the mental evaluations.
And we can even do some of those evaluations via Zoom.
Yeah, so it'll kind of be frontier. They're sort of at the frontier of the training of trainers in mental evaluation.
These people have been here for 2 or 3 months, so they're really just getting adjusted to being here, etc. There's not yet being provided services other than maybe English for mental health, wellness, and that.
Yeah, and it's not always the first thing on people's minds, so it's the timing might be okay because it's not like people are really focusing on getting here and getting established and being here.
Oh, yeah.
And it's almost, they have this, it's almost like you're here for a while and then it really hits you at this point here.
Yeah, like so much you're trying to do at the very beginning.
It's like you're so busy and you're, reintegrating, and then I think the idea that you take time for yourself and really sit down and work on this comes just a little bit after, or at least that's been our experience.
Well, before we conclude, I would like to ask Sadina, our case manager, to please come forward. She looks so beautiful in her clothes from Afghanistan. I just want to show you, here is Sadina, the one and only. And Sadina is also prepared for our guests today. Some goodie bags. They have, of course, the Grace Initiative sticker on it, so that's one good aspect. But inside are Afghan candies.
Oh.
So everyone who was kind enough and interested enough in learning about mental well-being and the plight of refugees gets a small reward. So I want to thank again Karen. She's traveled from Burlington to come here. Sadina, I'd like to thank Abdul also for attending. He's only been in the United States for like 3 days.
Welcome.
And Salam alaikum. And thanks to GNAT for kindly filming this and putting it on their network. And last but not least, the Dorset Village Library. Thank you, Erica. And thank you, our companions. Thank you, Erica. Thanks so much for coming.